Scottish Ghost Stories by Elliott O'Donnell. Case 10. The House near Blytheswood Square, Glasgow. The Haunted Bath. When Captain W.D.S. Smythe went to look over the house in the neighbourhood of Blytheswood Square, Glasgow, the only thing about the house he did not like was the bathroom. It struck him as excessively grim. The secret of the grimness did not lie, he thought, in any one particular feature. In the tall, gaunt geezer, for example, though there was always something in the look of a geezer when it was old and dilapidated, as was the case with this one, that repelled him. Or in the dark drying cupboard, or in the narrow slit-like window, but in the room as a whole, in its atmosphere and general appearance. He could not diagnose it. He could not associate it with anything else he had ever experienced. It was a grimness that he could only specify as grim. Grim with a grimness that made him feel he should not like to be alone there in the dead of night. It was a nuisance because the rest of the house pleased him. Moreover, the locality was convenient and the rent moderate, very moderate for such a neighbourhood. He thought the matter well over as he leaned in the doorway of the bathroom. He could, of course, have the room completely renovated. New paper, new paint, and a fresh bath. Hot water pipes. The geyser should be done away with. Geysers were hideous, dangerous, and what nonsense. Ghostly. Ghostly. What absurd rot. How his wife would laugh. Geysers were hideous, dangerous, and what nonsense. Ghostly. Ghostly. What absurd rot. How his wife would laugh. That decided the question. His wife. She had expressed a very ardent wish that he should take a house in or near Blytheswood Square, if he could get one on anything like reasonable terms, and here was his chance. He would accompany the agent of the property to the latter's office, and the preliminaries should be forthwith settled. 6 weeks later, he and his family were installed in the house, which still reeked with the smell of fresh paint and paper. The first thing the captain did when he got there was to steal away slyly to the bathroom, and as soon as he opened the door, his heart sank. Despite the many alterations the room had undergone, the grimness was still there everywhere. In the fine new 6-foot bath with its glistening, gleaming wooden framework, in the newly papered, newly painted cupboard, in the walls with their bright fresh paper, in the snowy surface of the whitewashed ceiling, in the air, the very air itself was full of it. The captain was, as a rule, very fond of his bath, but in his new quarters he firmly resolved that someone else should use the bath before he made the experiment. In a very few days the family had all settled down, and every one, with the exception of the captain, had had a bath. But no matter how many and how bitter were his wife's complaints, try how he would, he could not. He positively could not bring himself to wash in the bathroom alone. It was all right so long as the door was open, but his wife resolutely refused to allow him to keep it open, and the moment it was shut, his abject terror returned, a terror produced by nothing that he could in any way analyze or define. At last, ashamed of his cowardice, he screwed up courage, and, with a look of determined desperation in his eyes and mouth, an expression which sent his wife into fits of laughter, set out one night from his bedroom, candle in hand, and entered the bathroom. Shutting and locking the door, he lighted another candle, and, after placing them both on the mantel shelf, turned on the bath water and began to undress. "I may as well have a peep in the cupboard," he said, "just to satisfy myself no one is hiding there, for everyone in the house knows how I hate this beastly bathroom, with the intention of playing me a practical joke. Supposing one of the maids, Polly, for example, I'm sure she'd be quite capable, took it into her pretty head to... But here the captain was obliged to stop. He really was not equal to facing, even in his mind's eye, the situation such a supposition involved, and at the bare idea of such a thing, his countenance assumed a deeper hue, and, I am loath to admit, an amused grin. The grin, however, died out as he cautiously opened the door and peered furtively in. No one, nothing was there. With a breath of relief he closed the door again, placed a chair against it, and sitting down, proceeded to pull off his clothes. Coat, vest, undergarments, he placed them all tenderly in an untidy heap on the floor. Then, with a last lingering, affectionate look at them, walked sedately towards the bath. But this sedateness was only momentary. The first few steps he walked, but a noise in the grate startling him. He suddenly assumed an air of the greatest gaiety, and bowing with mock gallantry to his trousers, he now waltzed coquettishly to the bath. It was grim, horribly grim, and horribly hot too, for when he felt the temperature with one of his squat, podgy toes, it made him swear quite involuntarily. Turning on the cold water and slapping his thighs playfully, he felt again. Too hot yet, far too hot even for him. He loved heat. More cold, and he was hoisting one chubby leg to feel again, when a repetition of the noise in the grate, making him swing round, he lost his balance and descended on the floor with a very hard bump. For some seconds he lay still, too sulky and aggrieved even to get up, but the draught from under the ill-fitting door, tickling his bare flesh in the most immodest fashion, he roused himself from this lethargy, and was about to raise himself from the floor, when the lights went out without a moment's warning, and he found himself engulfed in the most funereal darkness. To say he was startled is to put it very mildly. He was absolutely terror-stricken. Far too terror-stricken to think of moving now, and least of all of getting up and groping for the matches. Indeed, when he came to think of it, he had not seen any matches in the room, and he had not brought any with him. His wife had flurried him so much. The moment the candles were extinguished, the grimness sensibly increased, and he could feel all around him, thickly amalgamated with the ether, a superphysical presence, at once hostile and horrible. Then, to bring his terror to a climax, there issued from the bath a loud rubbing and splashing, as if some very heavy person was vigorously washing. The water rose and fell, squished and bubbled as it does when one is lying at full length in it, raising and lowering oneself, kicking and plunging first on one side and then on the other. Whilst, to add to the realism, Captain Smythe distinctly heard gasping and puffing, and the soft, greasy sound of a well-soaped flannel. He could indeed follow every movement of the occupant of the bath as graphically as if he had seen him, from the brisk scrubbing of body and legs to the finicky process of cleaning the ears and toes. It was whilst the bather was occupied thus that the cupboard door began to open very quietly and stealthily, and Captain Smythe heard the chair he had so carefully placed against it being gradually propelled across the floor. Then something, he would have given anything to tell what, came out and began to steal towards him. He tried to crawl out of its way, but could not. His limbs no longer acted conjointly with his brain, and when he opened his mouth to shout at it, his voice withered away in his throat. It came up to him, and directly it touched his naked skin. He knew it was a woman with a much beflounced silk skirt and silk petticoats, a woman whose person was perfumed with violets, a scent for which the captain had a particular weakness, and without doubt loaded with jewellery. Her behaviour did not betray any symptoms of embarrassment when she encountered the captain lying on the floor, but planting one icy cold high-heeled shoe on his chest and the other on his cheek, she stepped on him as if he had been an orthodox cushion or footstool purposely placed there for her convenience. A hollow exclamation which died away in a gasp issued from the bath as the woman, with a swift movement of her arms, threw something over it. What followed the captain could only surmise, but from the muttered imprecations and splashes in the water it seemed to him that nothing short of murder was taking place. After a while the noises in the bath grew feebler and feebler, and when they finally ceased, the woman, with a sigh of relief, shook the water from her arms and, stepping off the captain, moved towards the fireplace. The spell, which had up to the present enthralled the unfortunate captain, was now broken, and, thinking that his ghostly visitor had betaken herself right away, he sat up. He had hardly done so before the darkness was rudely dissipated, and to his horror he saw, looking at him from a distance of only a few feet, a white luminous face, presumably that of a woman. But what a woman! What a devil! What a match for the most lurid of any of Satan's male retainers! Yet she was not without beauty, beauty of the richest sensual order, beauty that, had it been flesh and blood, would have sent men mad. Her hair, jet black, wavy and parted in the centre, was looped over her shell-like ears, which were set unusually low and far back on her head. Her nose was of that rare and matchless shape termed Grecian, and her mouth, in form, a triumph of all things heavenly, in expression, a triumph of all things hellish. The magnificent turn of its short upper lip, and the soft voluptuous line of its underlip, its sportive dimples and ripe red colour, its even rows of dazzling pearly teeth were adorable, but they appealed to the senses and in no sense or shape to the soul. Her brows, slightly irregular in outline, met over the nose. Her eyelashes were of great length, and her eyes, slightly, ever so slightly, ever so slightly, obliquely set, and larger than those of living human beings, were black, black as her hair, and the pupils sparkled and shone with the most damnable expression of satanical hatred and glee. The whole thing, the face and the light that emanated from it, was so entirely awful and devilish that Captain Smythe sat like one turned to stone, and it was not until long after it had vanished that he groped his way to the door, and in Adam's costume, for he dared not stay to put on his clothes, fled down the passage to his bedroom. From his wife he got little sympathy. Her sarcasm was too deep for words, and she merely ordered her husband on no account to breathe a word of his silliness before either the children or the servants. The injunction, however, which was naturally carried out to the letter, was futile as a precaution, for on running into the bathroom one morning when everyone else was downstairs, the eldest boy, Ronald, saw floating in the bath the body of a hoary-headed old man. It was bloated and purplish blue, and had big glassy eyes that stared at him in such a hideous, meaningless manner that he uttered a scream of terror and fled. Alarmed at the noise, most of the household ran to see what had happened. Only the captain remained behind. He knew only too well, and he hid, letting his wife and the servants go upstairs alone. They entered the bathroom. There was nothing in the bath, not even water, but as they were leaving, they ran into a dark, handsome, evil-eyed woman, clad in the most costly of dresses and sparkling with jewellery. She glided past them with sly, silent footsteps and vanished by the cupboard. Cured of scepticism and throwing dignity to the wind, the captain's wife raced downstairs and, bursting into the drawing-room, flung herself on the sofa in hysterics. Within a week, the house was once again empty, and the rumour getting about that it was haunted. The landlord threatened the Smythes with an action for slander of title. But I do not think the case was taken to court, the Smythes agreeing to contradict the report they had originated. Astute inquiries, however, eventually led them to discover that a lady, answering to the description of the ghost they had seen, had once lived at the house. Of Spanish descent, she was young, beautiful and gay, and was married to a man, an extremely wealthy man. People remembered how rich he was after he died, old enough to be her grandfather. They had nothing in common, the husband only wanting to be quiet, the wife to flirt and be admired. Their neighbours often heard them quarrel, and it was declared that the wife possessed the temper of a fiend. The man was eventually found dead in his bath, and there being no indications of violence, it was generally supposed that he had fainted, his wife having been previously heard to declare that he often had fainting fits, and had thus been accidentally drowned. The beautiful young widow, who inherited all his money, left the house immediately and went abroad, and the neighbours, when questioned by the Smythes as to whether anything had been seen of her since, shook their heads dubiously, but refused to commit themselves. Case 11. The Choking Ghost of Hill House, near Sandyford Place, Glasgow. The last time I was passing through Glasgow, I put up for the night at an hotel near Sandyford Place, and met there an old theatrical acquaintance named Brown, Hilly Brown. Not having seen him since I gave up acting, which is now, alas, a good many years, we had much to discuss. Touring days, lodgings, managers, crowds, and a dozen other subjects, all included in the vulgar term shop. We spent the whole of one evening debating thus in the smoke room, whilst the following night we went to an entertainment given by that charming reciter and raconteur, Miss Lillian North, who, apart from her talent, which in my opinion places her in the first rank of her profession, is the possessor of extraordinary personal attractions, not the least remarkable of which are her hands. Indeed, it was through my attention being called to the latter that I am indirectly indebted for this story. Miss North has typically psychic hands, exquisitely white and narrow, and her long tapering fingers and filbert nails, which, by the way, are always trimly manicured, are the most perfect I have ever seen. I was alluding to them on our way back to the hotel after her performance when Healy Brown interrupted me. "Talking about psychic things, O'Donnell," he said. "Do you know there is a haunted house near where we are staying?" "You don't? Very well, then. If I tell you what I know and you write about it, will you promise not to allude to the house by its right number? If you do, there will be the dickens to pay. Simply call it Hill House, near Sandyford Place. You promise? Good. Let us take a little stroll before we turn in. I feel I want a breath of fresh air, and I will tell you the experience I once had there. It is exactly 2 years ago, and I was on a tour here in the green bushes. All the usual theatrical diggings had been snapped up long before I arrived, and not knowing where else to go, I went to Hill House, Sandyford Place, which I saw advertised in one of the local papers as a first-class private hotel with very moderate charges. A wild bit of extravagance, eh? But then one does do foolish things sometimes, and to tell the truth I wanted a change badly. I had digged for a long time with a fellow called Charlie Grosvenor. Not at all a bad chap, but rather apt to get on one's nerves after a while, and he had got on mine horribly. Consequently, I was not at all sorry for an excuse to get away from him for a bit, even though I had to pay dearly for it. A private hotel in a neighbourhood like that of Sandyford Place is a big order for an ordinary comedian. I forget exactly what the terms were, but I know I pulled rather a long face when I was told. Still, being, as I say, tired of the usual digs, I determined to try it, and accordingly found myself landed in a nice-sized bedroom on the second floor. The first 3 nights passed, and nothing happened, saving that I had the most diabolical nightmares, a very unusual thing for me. It was the cheese, I said to myself when I got out of bed the first morning. I will take very good care I don't touch cheese tonight. I kept this resolution, but I had the nightmare again, and even if anything, worse than before. Then I fancied it must be cocoa. I was at that time a teetotaler, so I took hot milk instead, but I had a nightmare all the same, and my dreams terrified me to such an extent that I did not dare get out of bed in the morning. It was then winter, till it was broad daylight. It was now becoming a serious matter with me. As you know, an actor, more than most people, needs sleep, and it soon became as much as I could do to maintain my usual standard of acting. On the 4th night, determining to get rest at all costs, I took a stiff glass of hot brandy just before getting into bed. I slept. I could scarcely help sleeping, but not for long, for I was rudely awakened from my slumbers by a loud crash. I sat up in bed, thinking the whole house was falling about my ears. The sound was not repeated, and all was profoundly silent. Wondering what on earth the noise could have been, and feeling very thirsty, I got out of bed to get a drink of lime juice. To my annoyance, however, though I groped about everywhere, knocking an ashtray off the mantelpiece and smashing the lid of the soap dish, I did find neither the lime juice nor matches. At length, giving it up as a bad job, I decided to get into bed again. With that end in view, I groped my way through the darkness, steering myself by the furniture, the position of which was, of course, quite familiar to me. At least, I imagined it was. Judge then of my astonishment when I could not find the bed. At first I regarded it as a huge joke and laughed. How rich! Ha ha ha! Fancy not being able to find one's way back to bed in a room of this dimension. Good enough for Punch. Too good, perhaps. Now, ha ha! But it soon grew past a joke. I had been round the room, completely round the room, twice, and still no bed. I became seriously alarmed. Could I be ill? Was I going mad? But no, my forehead was cool, my pulse normal. For some seconds I stood still, not knowing what else to do. Then, to make one more desperate attempt, I stuck straight in front of me and ran into something that recoiled and hit me. Thrilled with amazement, I put up my hand to feel what it was, and touched a noose. I ejaculated, interrupting Healy Brown for the first time since he began. Yes, a noose, he repeated, suspended in mid-air. As you can imagine, I was greatly astonished, for I knew there had been nothing that I could be now mistaking for a noose in the room overnight. I stretched out my arms to feel to what it was fastened to. But, to add to my surprise, the cord terminated in thin air. Then I grew frightened, and dropping my arms, tried to move away from the spot. I could not. My feet were glued to the floor. With a gentle purring sound, the noose commenced fawning. I use that word because the action was so intensely bestial. so like that of a cat or snake, round my neck and face. It then rose above me, and after circling furiously round and creating a miniature maelstrom in the air, descended gradually over my head. Lower and lower it stole like some sleek caressing slug, now past the tips of my ears, now my nose, now my chin, until, with a tiny thud, it landed on my shoulders, when, with a fierce snap, it suddenly tightened. I endeavoured to tear it off, but every time I raised my hands, a strong magnetic force drew them to my side again. I opened my mouth to shriek for help, and an icy current of air froze the breath in my lungs. I was helpless, O'Donnell, utterly, wholly helpless. Cold, clammy hands tore my feet from the floor. I was hoisted bodily up and then let drop. A frightful pain shot through me. 100 wires cut into my throat at once. I gasped, choked, suffocated, and in my mad efforts to find a foothold, kicked out frantically in all directions. But this only resulted in an increase of my torments, since with every plunge the noose grew tauter. My agony at last grew unbearable. I could feel the sides of my raw, palpitating thorax driven into one another, while every attempt to heave up breath from my bursting lungs was rewarded with the most excruciating paroxysms of pain, pain more acute than I thought it possible for any human being to endure. My head became 10 times its natural size. Blood, foaming, boiling blood poured into it from God knows where, and under its pressure my eyes bulged in their sockets and the veins in my nose cracked. Terrific thunderings echoed and re-echoed in my ears. My tongue, huge as a mountain, shot against my teeth. A sea of fire raged through my brain, and then blackness, blackness inconceivable. When I recovered consciousness, O'Donnell, I found myself standing, cold and shivering, but otherwise sound and whole, on the chilly oilcloth. I had now no difficulty in finding my way back to bed, and in about an hour's time succeeded in falling asleep. I slept till late, and on getting up tried to persuade myself that my horrible experience was but the result of another nightmare. As you may guess, after all this I did not look forward to bedtime, and counted the minutes as they flew by with the utmost regret. Never had I been so sorry when my performance at the theatre was over, and the lights of my hotel once again hove in sight. I entered my bedroom in fear and trembling, and was so apprehensive lest I should be again compelled to undergo the sensations of hanging, that I decided to keep a light burning all night, and for that reason had bought half a pound of wax candles. At last I grew so sleepy that I could keep awake no longer, and placing the candlestick on a chair by the bed, I scrambled in between the sheets. Without as much as a sip of spirits, I slept like a top. When I awoke, the room was in pitch darkness. A curious smell at once attracted my notice. I thought at first it might be but the passing illusion of a dream, but no, I sniffed again. It was there, close to me, under my very nose, the strong, pungent odour of drugs. But not being a professor of smells, nor even a humble student of physics, I was consequently unable to diagnose it, and could only arrive at the general conclusion that it was a smell that brought with it very vivid recollections of a chemist's shop, and of my old school laboratory. Wondering whence it originated, I thrust my face forward with the intention of trying to locate it, when, to my horror, my lips touched against something cold and flabby. In an agony of fear, I reeled away from it, and the bed being narrow, I slipped over the edge and bumped onto the floor. Now, I think it is quite possible that up to this point you may have attributed my unhappy experience to nothing more nor less than a bad dream. But your dream theory can no longer hold good, for, on coming in such sudden contact with the floor, I gave my funny bone a knock, which I can assure you made me thoroughly awake. And the first thing I noticed on recovering my scattered senses was the smell. I sat up and saw, to my terror, my bed was occupied, but occupied in the most alarming manner. On the middle of the pillow was a face, the face of... I looked closer. I would have given every penny I possessed not to have done so, but I could not help myself. I looked closer, and it was the face of my brother Ralph. You may recollect my mentioning him to you, for he was the only one of us who was at that time making money, whom I believed to be in New York. He had always been rather sallow, but apart from the fact that he now looked very yellow, his appearance was quite natural. Indeed, as I gazed at him, I grew so convinced that it was he that I cried out, "Ralph!" The moment I did so, there was a ghastly change. His eyelids opened, and his eyes I recognized at once, protruded to such a degree that they almost rolled out. His mouth flew open, his tongue swelled, his whole countenance became convulsed with the most unparalleled, and for that reason indescribable expression of agony, whilst the yellowness of his complexion deepened to a livid, lurid black that was so inconceivably repellent and hellish that I sprang away from the bed, appalled. There was then a gasping, rasping noise, and a voice that, despite its unnatural hollowness, I identified as that of Ralph, broke forth. There was then a gasping, rasping noise, and a voice that, despite its unnatural hollowness, I identified as that of Ralph, broke forth. "I have been wanting to speak to you for ages, but something I cannot explain has always prevented me. I have been dead a month. Not cancer, but Dolly. Poison. Goodbye, Healy. I shall rest in peace now." The voice stopped. There was a rush of cold air, laden with the scent of the drug, and tainted, faintly tainted, with the nauseating smell of the grave. And the face on the pillow vanished. How I got through the remainder of the night I cannot say. I dare not think. I dare only remember that I did not sleep. I was devoted to Ralph, and the thought that he had perished in the miserable manner suggested by the apparition completely prostrated me. In the morning I received a black-edged letter from my mother, stating that she had just heard from Dolly, my brother's wife, saying Ralph had died from cancer in the throat. Dolly added in a postscript that her dearly beloved Ralph had been very good to her, and left her well provided for. Of course, we might have had the body exhumed, but we were poor, and Ralph's widow was rich. And in America, you know, everything goes in favour of the dollars. Hence, we were obliged to let the matter drop, sincerely trusting Dolly would never take it into her head to visit us. She never did. My mother died last year. I felt her death terribly. O'Donnell, and as I no longer have any fixed abode, but am always touring the British provinces, there is not much fear of Ralph's murderess. I felt her death terribly, O'Donnell, and as I no longer have any fixed abode, but am always touring the British provinces, there is not much fear of Ralph's murderess and I meeting. It is rather odd, however, that after my own experience at the hotel, I heard that it had borne the reputation for being haunted for many years, and that a good many visitors who had passed the night in one of the rooms, presumably mine, had complained of hearing strange noises and having dreadful dreams. How can one explain it all? One can't, I responded, as we turned in for the night. Case 12. The Grey Piper and the heavy coach of Donald Goerry House, Perth. Donald Goerry House, until comparatively recent times, stood on the outskirts of Perth. It was a long, low, rambling old place, dating back to the beginning of the 17th century. At the time of the narrative, it was in the possession of a Mr. William Whittingham, who bought it at a very low price from some people named Tyler. It is true that it would cost a small fortune to repair, but notwithstanding this disadvantage, Mr. Whittingham considered his purchase a bargain, and was more than satisfied with it. Indeed, he knew of no other house of a similar size, of such an imposing appearance, and so pleasantly situated that he could have bought for less than twice the amount he had paid for this. And he was really very sorry for the Tylers, who explained to him in confidence that had they not been in such urgent need of money, they would never have sold Donald Goerry House at such a ridiculously low figure. However, with them it was a question of cash down, and Mr. Whittingham had only to write out a cheque for the modest sum they asked, and the house was his. It was June when Mr. Whittingham took possession of the house, June, when the summer sun was brightest and the gardens looked their best. The Whittingham family consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Whittingham, 2 sons, Ernest and Harvey, and 3 daughters, Ruth, Martha, and Mary. Were, as one might gather from their names, alone, plain, practical, genteel, and in fact very superior people, who were by no means lacking in that exceedingly useful quality of canniness, so characteristic of the lowland Scot, to which race they belonged. Mr. Whittingham had for years conducted a grocery business in Jedburgh, twice filling the honoured and coveted post of mayor, and when he at length retired into private life, his friends, and it was astonishing how many friends he had, shrewdly suspected that his pockets were not only well lined but full to bursting. Acting on the advice of his wife and daughters, who were keen on social distinction, he sent Ernest to Oxford, conditionally that he should take holy orders in the Church of England, whilst Harvey, who, when scarcely out of the petticoat stage, displayed the regular Whittingham talent for business by covertly helping himself to the sugar in his father's shop, and disposing of it at strictly sale price to his sister's cronies in the nursery, was sent to one of those half-preparatory and half-finishing schools, of course for the sons of gentlemen only, at Edinburgh, where he was kept till he was old enough to be articled to a preposterous, exceedingly preposterous firm of solicitors. The girls, Ruth and Martha and Mary, had likewise been highly educated. That is to say, they had remained so many years at an English seminary for young ladies, and had been given a final 12 months in France and Germany, to enable them to obtain the correct accent. At the time of the story they were as yet unmarried, and were awaiting with the most laudable patience the advent of men of title. They were delighted with their new home, which Ruth had persuaded her father to christen Donald Goerry, after the house in a romantic novel she had just been reading, and proud of their gilded premises and magnificent tennis lawns, they had placed a gigantic and costly tray in the hall, in confident assurance that it would speedily groan beneath the weight of cards from all the gentry in Perthshire. But please be it understood that my one and only object in alluding to those trifling details is to point out that the Whittinghams, being entirely engrossed in matters mundane, were the very last people in the world to be termed superstitious, and although imaginative where future husbands' calls and cards were concerned, prior to the events about to be narrated, had not an ounce of superstition in their natures. Indeed, until then, they had always smiled in a very supercilious manner at even the smallest mention of a ghost. September came, their first September in Donald Goerri, and the family welcomed with joy Ernest and his youthful bride. The latter was not as they had fondly hoped, and roundly announced in Perth. The daughter of a peer, but of a wealthy Bristol draper, the owner of a house near the Downs, whose son had been one of Ernest's many friends at Oxford. The coming of the newly married pair to Donald Goerri brought with it a burst of bird-like gaiety, all sorts of entertainments, musical, at-home, dinners, dances, tennis and garden parties, in fact, every variety that accorded with the family's idea of good taste were given, and with praiseworthy push, for which the Whittingons had fast become noted, all the county was invited. This splendid display of wealth and hospitality was not disinterested. I fear it might be not only accounted a send-off for the immaculately clad curate and his wife, but also a determined effort on the part of Mr. and Mrs. Whittingon to attract the right sort of lover for their girls. It was during the progress of one of their alfresco entertainments that the scepticism of certain of the Whittingons with regard to the supernatural received a rude blow. Martha, Mary, and two eligible young men, friends of Harvey's, having finished a somewhat spirited game of croquet, were refreshing themselves with lemonade whilst they continued their flirtation. Presently Mary, whose partner declared how much she should like to see some photographs she had recently had taken of herself, with a well-affected giggle of embarrassment set off to the house to fetch her album. The minutes passed, and as she did not return, Martha went in search of her. The album, she knew, was in their boudoir, which was situated in the end of the long and rather gloomy corridor of the upper story. Highly incensed at her sister's slowness, she was hastening along the corridor when, to her supreme astonishment, she suddenly saw the figure of a man in kilts, with a bagpipe under his arm, emerge through the half-open door of the boudoir, and with a peculiar gliding motion advanced towards her. A curious feeling, with which she was totally unfamiliar, compelled her to remain mute and motionless. And in this condition she awaited the approach of the stranger. Who was he? She asked herself, and how on earth had he got there? What was he doing? As he drew nearer, she perceived that his face was all one hue, a ghastly livid grey, and that his eyes, which were all the time fixed on hers, were lurid and menacing, so terrible in fact that she turned cold with fear, and felt the very hair on her head beginning to rise on end. She opened her mouth to shriek, but found she could not ejaculate a syllable. Neither could she, even with the most desperate efforts, tear her feet from the floor. On came the figure, and without swerving, either to the right or left, it glided right up to and through her. And as she involuntarily turned round, she saw it disappear through a half-open staircase window, at least 20 feet above the ground outside. Shaking all over with terror, and not understanding in the slightest what to make of it, Martha ran to the boudoir, where her heart almost sprang out of her body at the spectacle of her sister Mary stretched at full length on the floor, her cheeks ashy pale, her lips blue. Martha at once made a frantic rush to the bell, and in a few minutes half the establishment, headed by Mr. Whittingon, poured into the room. With the aid of a little cold water, Mary speedily recovered, and, in reply to the anxious inquiries of her sympathetic rescuers as to what had happened, indignantly demanded why such a horrible-looking creature as that Piper had been allowed not merely to enter the house, but to come up to her room, and half frighten her to death. "I had just got my album," she added, "when feeling someone was in the room. I turned round, And there," she indicated a spot on the carpet, "was the piper, not 10 paces away from me, regarding me with the most awful look imaginable. I was too taken aback with surprise to say anything, nor, for some unaccountable reason, could I escape, before he touched me on the shoulder with one of his icy cold hands, and then commenced playing. Up and down the floor he paced backwards and forwards, never taking his hateful glance off my face, and ever piping the same dismal dirge. At last, unable to stand the strain of it any longer, and convinced he was a madman bent on murdering me, for who but a lunatic would behave in such a way, I gave way to a violent fit of hysterics and fainted. Now tell me who he was, and why he was permitted to frighten me in this manner." And Mary stamped her feet and grew vicious, as only her class will, when they are at all vexed. Her speech was followed by a silence that exasperated her. She repeated her inquiries with crimson cheeks, and then, as again no one responded, she signalled out the head footman and raved at him. Up to this point, Mr. Whittingham had been dumb with amazement. The idea of a strange piper having the twofold effrontery to enter his house and proceed to the private and chaste sanctuary of his highly respectable daughters almost deprived him of breath. He could scarcely believe his ears. What in the name of... what does it all mean?" he at length stammered, addressing the unfortunate footman. "A piper? And without any invitation from me? How dare you let him in?" "I did not, sir," the luckless footman replied. "No such person came to the door when I was in the hall." "No more he did when I was there," chimed in the second footman, and all the other servants vociferated in a body. "We never saw any piper, sir, nor heard one either," and they looked at Mary reproachfully. At this, Mr. Whittingham looked exceedingly embarrassed. In the face of such a unanimous denial, what could he say? He knew if he suggested the servants were untruthful, they would all give notice to leave on the spot. And knowing good servants are scarce in Perth, as elsewhere, he felt rather in a fix. At length, turning to Mary, he asked if she was sure it was a piper. "Sure!" Mary screamed. "Why, of course I am! Did I not tell you he marched up and down here playing on his disgusting bagpipes, which nearly broke the drum of my ear?" "And I saw him too, Pa," Martha put in. "I met him in the corridor. He had his pipes under his arm, and the most dreadful expression in his face. I don't wonder Mary was frightened." "But where did he go?" Mr. Whittingham cried. "You would not believe me if I told you," Martha said, her cheeks flushing. "He seemed to pass right through me, and then to vanish through the staircase window. I have never been so terribly upset in my life." And sinking onto the sofa, she began to laugh hysterically. Dear me, it is very odd," Mr. Whittingham exclaimed, as Mary handed her sister a wine-glass of sal volatile. "They can't both have been dreaming. It must. But there, what a nonsensical notion. There are no such things as ghosts. Only children and nursemaids believe in them nowadays. As soon as you have quite recovered, my dears, we will return to the garden, and I think under the circumstances, the rather peculiar circumstances, it will be better to say nothing to your mother. Do you understand, Mr. Whittingham?" Mr. Whittingham went on, eyeing the servants. "Nothing to your mistress." The affair thus terminated, and for some days nothing further happened to disturb the peace of the family. At the end of a week, however, exactly a week after the appearance of the piper, Mary met with a serious accident. She was running across the croquet lawn to speak to her sister-in-law when she tripped over a hoop that had been accidentally left there, and, in falling, ran a hat-pin into her head. Blood poisoning ensued, and within a fortnight she was dead. Martha was the only one in the house, however, who associated Mary's accident and death with the piper. To her, that sinister expression in the mysterious Highlander's eyes portended mischief, and she could not but suspect that, in some way or another, he had brought about the catastrophe. The autumn waned, and Christmas was well within sight, when another mysterious occurrence took place. It was early one Sunday evening. Tea was just over, and the Whittingham family was sitting round the fire, engaged in a somewhat melancholy conversation, for the loss of Mary had affected them all very deeply, when they heard the faraway rumble of a heavy coach on the high road. Nearer and nearer it came, till it seemed to be about on a level with the front lodge gate. Then, to their surprise, there was a loud crunching of gravel, and they heard it careering at a breakneck speed up the carriage driveway. They looked at one another in the utmost consternation. A coach, and driven in this mad fashion! Whose was it? What did it mean? Not visitors, surely. It pulled up at the front door, and the champing and stamping of the horses vibrated loudly through the still night air. Sounds as of one or more people descending were next heard, and then there came a series of the most terrific knockings at the door. The Whittingham family stared at one another aghast. There was something in those knockings, something they could not explain, that struck terror in their souls and made their blood run cold. They waited in breathless anxiety for the door to be opened, but no servant went to open it. The knocks were repeated, if anything louder than before. The door swung back on its hinges, and the tread of heavy footsteps were heard slowly approaching the drawing-room. Mrs. Whittingham gave a low gasp of horror. Ruth screamed. Harvey buried his face in his hands. Mr. Whittingham rose to his feet and made desperate efforts to get to the bell, but could not stir, whilst Martha rushed to the drawing-room door and locked it. They then, with one accord, began to pray. The steps halted outside the room. The door slowly opened, and the blurred outlines of a group of ghastly-looking figures, supporting a grotesquely shaped object in their midst, appeared on the threshold. For some seconds there was a grim silence. It was abruptly broken by a thud. Ruth had slipped from her chair to the floor in a dead faint, whereupon the shadowy forms solemnly veered and made their way back again to the front door. The latter swung violently open. There was a rush of icy wind which swept like a hurricane across the hall and into the drawing-room. The front door then slammed to with a crash, and the coach drove away. Everyone's attention was now directed to Ruth. At first, sal volatile and cold water produced no effect, but after a time she slowly, very slowly regained consciousness. As soon as she had recovered sufficiently to speak, she expressed an earnest desire that no reference should ever be made in her presence to what had just happened. "It was for me," she said in such an emphatic tone as filled her audience with the direct forebodings. "I know it was for me. They all looked in my direction. God help me, I shall die like Mary." Though greatly perplexed as to what she meant, for no one expecting herself had been able to make out the phenomena with any degree of distinctiveness. They yielded to her entreaties and asked her no questions. The servants had neither heard nor seen anything. A fortnight later Ruth was taken ill with appendicitis. Peritonitis speedily set in, and she died under the operation. The Whittinghams now began to wish they had never come to Donald Gowrie, but, with the astuteness that had been characteristic of the family through countless generations of fair days and foul, they took the greatest precautions, never to drop even as much as a hint to the servants or to anyone in the town that the house was haunted. A year passed without any further catastrophe, and they were beginning to hope their ghastly visitors had left them, when something else occurred. It was Easter time, and Ernest, his wife, and baby were staying with them. The baby, a boy, was fat and bonny, the very picture of health and happiness. Mrs. Whittingham and Martha vied with one another in their devotion to him, and either one or other of them was always dancing attendance on him. It so happened that one afternoon, whilst the servants were having their tea, Martha found herself alone in the upper part of the house with her precious nephew. Mr. Whittingham had gone to Edinburgh to consult his lawyer, the head of the firm with whom Harvey was articled, on business. Martha, though a little appreciative of the beauties of nature as most commercial-minded young women, could not but admire the colouring of the sky as she looked out of the nursery window. The sun had disappeared, but the effect of its rays was still apparent on the western horizon, where the heavens were washed with alternate streaks of gold and red and pink, the colour of each streak excessively brilliant in the centre, but paling towards the edges. Here and there were golden, pink-tipped clouds and crimson islets surrounded with seas of softest blue, and outside the limits of this sun-kissed pale, the blue of the sky gradually grew darker and darker, until its line was altogether lost in the black shadows of night, that, creeping over the lone mountain-tops in the far east, slowly swept forward. Wafted by the gentle breeze came the dull moaning and whispering of the pine-trees, the humming of the wind through the telephone wires, and the discordant cawing of the crows. And it seemed to Martha, as she sat there and peered out into the garden, that over the whole atmosphere of the place had come a subtle and hostile change. A change in the noises of the trees, the birds, the wind, a change in the flower-scented ether. A change, a most marked and emphatic change, in the shadows. What was it? What was this change? Whence did it originate? What did it portend? A slight noise, a most trivial noise, attracted Martha's attention to the room. She looked round and was quite startled to see how dark it had grown. In the old days, when she had scoffed at ghosts, she would as soon have been in the dark as in the light. The night had no terrors for her, but now, since those awful occurrences last year, all was different, and as she peered apprehensively about her, her flesh crawled. What was there in that corner opposite? That corner hemmed in on the one side by the cupboard. How she hated cupboards, particularly when they had shiny surfaces on which were reflected all sorts of curious things. And the chest of drawers on the other. It was a shadow, only a shadow, but of what? She searched the room everywhere to find its material counterpart, and at last discovered it in the nurse's shawl which hung over the back of a chair. Then she laughed, and would have gone on laughing, for she tried to persuade herself that laughter banished ghosts, when suddenly something else caught her eyes. What was it? An object that glittered evilly like two eyes. She got up in a state of the most hideous fascination and walked towards it. Then she laughed again. It was a pair of scissors. The nurse's scissors, clean, bright, and sharp. Why did she pick them up and feel the blades so caressingly with her thumb? Why did she glance from them to the baby? Why, in the name of God, why? Frightful ideas laid hold of her mind. She tried to chase them away, but they quickly returned. The scissors. Why were they in her fingers? Why could not she put them down? For what were they intended? Cutting thread and tape and throats. And she giggled hysterically at the bare notion. But what was this round her waist? The scissors. Why were they in her fingers? Why could not she put them down? For what were they intended? Cutting thread and tape and throats. And she giggled hysterically at the bare notion. But what was this round her waist, this shadowy arm-like object? She looked fearfully round, and her soul died within her as she encountered the malevolent, gleeful eyes of the sinister piper pressed closely against her face. Was it she he wanted this time? She, or whom? In the name of all that was pitiable! Desperately, as if all the lives in the universe and the future of her soul were at stake, did she struggle to free herself from his grasp, but in vain. Every fibre, every muscle of her body was completely at his will. On and on he pushed her, until foot by foot, inch by inch, she approached the candle, and all the while his hellish voice was breathing the vilest inspirations into her brain. At last she stood by the side of the baby and bent over it. What a darling! What a dear! What a duck! A sweet, pretty, innocent, prattling duck. How like her mother! How like her handsome brother! How like herself! Very, very like herself! How everyone loved it! How everyone worshipped it! How— and here the grave face beside her chuckled— everyone would miss it! How pink its toes, how fat its calves, how chubby its little palms, how bonny its cheeks, and how white, how gloriously, heavenly, snowy white its throat. And she stretched forth one of her stubby, inartistic fingers and played with its flesh. Then she glanced furtively at the scissors and smiled. It was soon done, soon over, and she and the grave-faced piper danced a minuet in the moonbeams. Afterwards he piped a farewell dirge, a wild, weird, funereal dirge, and, marching slowly backwards, his dark, gleaming eye fixed gloatingly on hers, disappeared through the window. Then the reaction set in, and Martha raved and shrieked till everyone in the house flew to the rescue. Of course, no one, saving her father and mother, believed her. Ernest, his wife, and the servants attributed her bloody act to jealousy, the law to madness, and she subsequently journeyed from Donald to a criminal lunatic asylum, where the recollection of all she had done soon killed her. This was the climax. Mr. Whittingham sold Donald Goerry, and a new house was shortly afterwards erected in its stead. Case 13. The floating head of the Benrachett Inn, near the Perth Road, Dundee. Some years ago, when I was engaged in collecting cases for a book I contemplated publishing, on haunted houses in England and Wales, I was introduced to an Irish clergyman, whose name I have forgotten, and whom I have never met since. Had the incident he related taken place in England or Wales, I should have noted it down carefully, but as it occurred in Scotland, and I had no intention then of bringing out a volume on Scottish phantasms, I did not do so. My memory, however, I can assure my readers, in spite of the many ghost tales committed to it, for scarcely a day passes that I do not hear one, seldom fails. My memory, however, I can assure my readers, in spite of the many ghost tales committed to it, for scarcely a day passes that I do not hear one, seldom fails. And the Irishman clergyman story, which I am about to relate, comes back to me now with startling vividness. One summer evening, early in the 80s, Mr. Murphy, the name by which I will designate the originator of this story, and his wife arrived in Dundee. The town was utterly unknown to them, and they were touring Scotland for the first time. Not knowing where to put up for the night, and knowing no one to whom they could apply for information, they consulted a local paper, and from the long list of hotels and boarding houses advertised therein, selected the Benrachett Inn near the Perth Road as being the one most likely to meet their modest requirements. They were certainly not disappointed with the exterior of the hotel they had chosen, for as soon as they saw it, they exclaimed simultaneously, "What a delightful old place! And old it certainly was, for the many gabled oaken structure and projecting windows unquestionably indicated the 16th century, whilst to enhance the effect and give it a true touch in detail of ye ancient times, a huge antique lantern was hung over the entrance. Nor did the interior impress them less favourably. The rooms were large and low, the ceilings, walls, floors, and staircase all of oak. The diamond lattice windows and narrow, tortuous passages, and innumerable nooks and crannies and cupboards created an atmosphere of combined quaintness and comfort that irresistibly appealed to the Murphys. Viewed under the searching rays of the sun and cheered by the voices of the visitors, the interior of the house, for artistic taste and cheerfulness, would indeed be hard to beat. But as Mrs. Murphy's eyes wandered up the stairs and down the corridors, she was filled with misgivings as to how the place would strike her at night. Though not nervous naturally, and by no means superstitious, at night, when the house was dark and silent, and the moon called forth the shadows, she was not without that feeling of uneasiness which most people, even avowed sceptics, experience when passing the night in strange and novel quarters. The room they engaged, I cannot say selected, as the hotel being full, they had Hobson's choice, was at the end of a very long passage, at the back of the house and overlooking the yard. It was a large apartment, and in one of its several recesses stood the bed, a gigantic ebony four-poster, with spotless clean valance and, what was of even greater importance, well-aired sheets. The other furniture in the room being of the same sort as that in the majority of old-fashioned hostels needs no description, but a fixture in the shape of a cupboard, a deep, dark cupboard, let into the wall facing the bed, instantly attracted Mrs. Murphy's attention. There is always something interesting in cupboards, particularly old and roomy cupboards, when it is night-time, and one is about to get into bed, and it is then that they suggest all manner of fascinating possibilities. It was to this cupboard, then, that Mrs. Murphy paid the greatest attention before commencing to undress prior to getting into bed. She poked about in it for some moments, and then, apparently satisfied that no one was hidden there, continued her investigation of the room. Mr. Murphy did not assist. He pleaded fatigue, and sat on the corner of the bed, munching a gingerbread and reading the Dundee Advertiser till the operation was over. He then helped Mrs. Murphy unpack their portmanteau, and during the process whiled away so much time in conversation that they were both startled when a clock from some adjacent church solemnly boomed 12. They were then seized with something approaching a panic, and hastened to disrobe. "I wish we had a night light, John," Mrs. Murphy said, as she got up from her prayers. "I suppose it wouldn't do to keep one of the candles burning. I am not exactly afraid, only I don't fancy being left in the dark. I had a curious sensation when I was in the cupboard just now. I can't exactly explain it, but I feel now that I would like the light left burning." "It certainly is rather a gloomy room," Mr. Murphy remarked, raising his eyes to the black oak ceiling, and then allowing them to dwell in turn on each of the angles and recesses. "And I agree with you, it would be nice if we had a night light, or, better still, gas. But, as we haven't, my dear, and we shall be on our feet a good deal tomorrow, I think we ought to try and get to sleep as soon as possible." He blew out the candle as he spoke, and quickly scrambled into bed. A long hush followed, broken only by the sound of breathing and an occasional ticking as of some long-legged creature on the wall and window blind. Mrs. Murphy could never remember if she actually went to sleep, but she is sure her husband did, as she distinctly heard him snore, and the sound, so detestable to her as a rule, was so welcome to her then. She was lying listening to it and wishing with all her soul she could get to sleep, when she suddenly became aware of a smell, a most offensive, pungent odour that blew across the room and crept up her nostrils. The cold perspiration of fear at once broke out on her forehead. Nasty as the smell was, it suggested something more horrible, something she dared not attempt to analyse. She thought several times of rousing her husband, but remembering how tired he had been, she desisted, and, with all her faculties abnormally on the alert, she lay awake and listened. A death-like hush hung over the house, interrupted at intervals by the surreptitious noises peculiar to the night, enigmatical creaks and footsteps, rustlings as of drapery, sighs and whispers, all very faint, all very subtle, and all possibly, just possibly, attributable to natural causes. Mrs. Murphy caught herself, why she could not say, waiting for some definite auditory manifestation of what she instinctively felt was near at hand. At present, however, she could not locate it. She could only speculate on its whereabouts. It was somewhere in the direction of the cupboard, and each time the stench came to her, the conviction that its origin was in the cupboard grew. At last, unable to sustain the suspense any longer, and urged on by an irresistible fascination, she got softly out of bed, and, creeping stealthily forward, found her way with surprisingly little difficulty, considering it was pitch dark and the room was unfamiliar to her, to the cupboard. With every step she took, the stink increased, and by the time she had reached the cupboard, she was almost suffocated. For some seconds she toyed irresolutely with the door-handle, longing to be back again in bed, but unable to tear herself away from the cupboard. At last, yielding to the demands of some pitilessly exacting unknown influence, she held her breath and swung open the door. The moment she did so, the room filled with the faint phosphorescent glow of decay, and she saw, exactly opposite her, a head, a human head, floating in mid-air. Petrified with terror, she lost every atom of strength, and, entirely bereft of the power to move or articulate a sound, she stood stock still, staring at it. That it was the head of a man she could only guess from the matted crop of short red hair that fell in a disordered entanglement over the upper part of the forehead and ears. All else was lost in a loathsome, disgusting mass of detestable decomposition, too utterly vile and foul to describe. On the abnormal thing, beginning to move forward, the spell that bound Mrs. Murphy to the floor was broken, and with a cry of horror she fled to the bed and awoke her husband. The head was by this time close to them, and had not Mrs. Murphy dragged her husband forcibly out of its way, it would have touched him. His terror was even greater than hers, but for the moment neither could speak. They stood clutching one another in an awful silence. Mrs. Murphy at length gasped out, "Pray, John, pray! Command the thing in the name of God to depart!" Mr. Murphy made a desperate effort to do so, but not a syllable would come. The head now veered round and was moving swiftly towards them, its awful stench causing them both to retch and vomit. Mr. Murphy, seizing his stick, lashed at it with all his might. The result was one they might well have expected. The stick met with no resistance, and the head continued to advance. Both Mr. and Mrs. Murphy then made a frantic attempt to find the door, the head still pursuing them, and tripping over something in their wild haste, fell together on the floor. There was now no hope. The head had caught them up. It hovered immediately above them, and, descending lower, lower and lower, finally passed right through them, through the floor and out of sight. It was long ere either of them could sufficiently recover to stir from the floor, and when they did move, it was only to totter to their bed, and to lie with the bedclothes well over their heads, quivering and quaking till the morning. The hot morning sun dissipating their fears, they got up, and hurrying downstairs demanded an interview with their landlord. It was in vain, the latter argued. It was all a nightmare. They showed the absurdity of such a theory by vehemently attesting they had both simultaneously experienced the phenomena. They were about to take their departure when the landlord, retracting all he had said, offered them another room and any terms they liked, if only they would stay and hold their tongues. "I know every word of what you say is true," he said, in such submissive tones that the tender hearts of Mr. and Mrs. Murphy instantly relented, and they promised to remain. "But what can I do? I cannot shut up a house which I have taken on a 20 years' lease, because one room in it is haunted. And, after all, there is only one visitor in 20 who is disturbed by the apparition. What is the history of the head? Why, it is said to be that of a pedlar who was murdered here over 100 years ago. The body was hidden behind the wainscoting, and his head under the cupboard floor. The miscreants were never caught. They are supposed to have gone down in a ship that sailed from this port just about that time and was never heard of again." This is the gist of the story the clergyman told me, and, believing it, as I undoubtedly do, to be true, there is every reason to suppose that the inn, to which I have, of course, given a fictitious name, if still in existence, is still haunted.